At the heart of so many painful family disputes is one simple question. When a home is full of conflict, who has to leave? For years, the answer to that seemed pretty cut and dry, but then a huge legal battle came along and completely changed the rules for everyone living under one roof. So let's get into what happened.
Think about this question. It really pits the rights of a wife against the rights of property owners. Is a daughter-in-law a family member who has a right to shelter, or is she more like a guest in a house that isn't legally hers? The courts have had to wrestle with this, and believe me, the answer is not as simple as you might think.
To really understand how the law on this works, you've got to understand the people involved. So let's go back to the family case that started it all, the one that set the original precedent for years.
Okay, so let's meet the key players. We have Neetu Mittal, the daughter-in-law, her husband, Vikash, and his parents, Kanta and Ram. And right from the get-go, here's the most crucial fact of all. The property itself was self-acquired. That means the parents bought it, they paid for it. It was their house, plain and simple.
So like a lot of families, they all lived together after the wedding. But things went south. The relationship just fell apart to the point where they said it was unbearable to live together. The parents, trying to fix things, even got a separate apartment for the couple, but Neetu refused to go, and the stalemate basically left the parents feeling like they had no other choice. They decided to take their own daughter-in-law to court.
And just like that, what started as a family crisis landed right in the middle of a courtroom, boiling down to a fundamental clash of rights.
So here you can see the two arguments laid bare. It's fascinating. On one side, you have Neetu. She's claiming a right to live in what she calls the matrimonial home, which is protected under the law as a shared household. But on the other side, her elderly in-laws are arguing, hold on, this is our private property. They said she was only allowed to live there because of a family bond that had totally shattered, and now they had a right to live peacefully in their own home.
So the Delhi High Court had to pick a side. And in 2008, it handed down a verdict that would pretty much become the law of the land for more than a decade. First off, the court did something huge. It basically redefined the whole idea of a matrimonial home. It ruled that just because a couple lives with the husband's parents, that doesn't automatically make it their legal matrimonial home. And that, right there, was a critical, game-changing distinction. And this quote from the judge, wow, it really lays out the court's logic perfectly. He said that in a house owned by the parents, an adult son has zero legal right to live there. He's only there at the mercy of his parents. The court's thinking then was, well, if the son has no legal right, how could his wife possibly have one? Now, courts don't just make this stuff up. They were leaning on an older, super important Supreme Court ruling called the Batra case. Think of it like their playbook. And that precedent defined a shared household really, really narrowly. It said it had to be a property owned or rented by the husband or a joint family property where he had a share. Since this house belonged only to the in-laws, it didn't count. So the big takeaway was this. Any claim Neetu had for housing, well, that was an issue to take up with her husband, not his parents. And so the verdict was crystal clear. The court order was upheld. The parents won. Their right to peace and to enjoy their own property was seen as more important than their daughter-in-law's claim to live there. But, the law doesn't just sit still. For over a decade, this ruling was the final word on the matter. And then, well, everything changed. Think about that. For 12 long years, that was the standard. A daughter-in-law had no claim on her in-law's self-acquired property. End of story. But in 2020, the ground underneath this whole legal idea just completely shifted. It was a different family, but a very, very similar story. This new case, Satish Chander Ahuja versus Sneha Ahuja, it worked its way all the way up to the Supreme Court, forcing a total re-examination of this entire issue. Okay, this is where it all comes together. Just look at the dramatic shift, side by side. In 2020, the Supreme Court did a complete 180. The definition of a shared household, it went from narrow to incredibly broad. The whole ownership question? The court said the name on the title deed was no longer the be-all and end-all. And this is the big one. Parental rights were no longer supreme. They now had to be balanced against protecting the daughter-in-law. The entire focus of the law flipped from protecting property to protecting people. All right, so after all that legal drama, where does that leave families today? What are the rules of the house now? This new definition is so much wider. A shared household can now be a property owned by any relative, including in-laws, as long as the woman lived there with some degree of permanence as her marital home. See? Ownership is no longer the trump card it used to be. So what do you really need to remember now? First, the whole idea of a shared household is way, way bigger. Second, just because the in-laws own the property, it doesn't mean they get an automatic win to evict. And third, and this is probably the most important part, it's all a balancing act now. Courts have to weigh the woman's right to be protected against her in-laws' right to enjoy their property peacefully. There's no simple answer anymore. It really all comes down to the specific facts of every single case.
So we've gone from a clear-cut rule that favored property owners to a much more nuanced case-by-case approach. And it leaves us with this final, really big question. In trying to protect a potentially vulnerable woman without unfairly burdening elderly parents, has the law finally struck the right balance, or has it just created a whole new world of uncertainty?